Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 20th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, like I say every week, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I have the bandwidth to keep making this show. The way that we're able to continue that work and hire the people that I need to help support that, on top of my full-time postdoctoral fellowship and all the other stuff I'm doing is basically from individuals just like you who support the show on a per episode basis. If you're interested in doing so, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Baravaj, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Riva Keith, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right. So for this week's show, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Anna Shechtman. She's a journalist, a crossword constructor, and a college professor. And she has a brand new book out called The Riddles of the Sphinx, Inheriting the Feminist History of the Crossword Puzzle. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Anna Shechtman. Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk about your new book and just, so many interesting things. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited too.
So the book is called The Riddles of the Sphinx, Inheriting the Feminist History of the Crossword Puzzle. There are so many things. That's like even just the title. There's so many layers to it. So before we get into...
Believe me, trying to write that subtitle, figuring out what it was, especially because there is a memoir component, and I was adamant, like, we're not going to do my journey through anything. That's not what's going to happen here. So, there was a lot of discussion over how to include all of the different facets in a subtitle. But we can move
one
slowly
woman's
through it.
journey through the puzzle.
Exactly.
Yeah. You're right. That's why they're all titled that way. And then is this?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not out yet. It comes out. No, it is out. It came out on March 5th.
No, it's out.
I was reading May, but it's March. Oh, that's great. So people can already pick it up and they don't have to pre-order. Have you done, or do you guys plan to do like a UK version? Because in my experience, once you start selling to different, I guess I don't even know what you call them, but different markets, then they change the title on you. So that's fun.
Yeah, I think there is a UK version. I think it has the same title, but I don't know. I don't actually know the release date there. I have to say, there's so much about the marketing apparatus and the that I'm, blissfully ignorant of, and I kind of intend to stay that way. Like even the marketing copy, all of that, I would just sort of said, I defer to you. I am not a marketer, and thank God for that.
They know what they're doing. They've done this before.
Hopefully, right? Yeah.
And so, but is this your first book? I mean, you've written for a lot of outlets, but is this your first full-length book?
It is, yeah. I mean, you mentioned you've done a PhD, so I've written a dissertation, but I don't know what field you did your degree in.
You have your PhD? Yes, you do. Oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that. So I have to now, luckily, I was telling you, I record my intro separately. I've got to give you your full title when I intro you.
Oh, well. Yeah, so
Dr. Shechtman.
I'm now, right, yeah, no, don't do that.
I'm going to. I'm going to be an asshole. No, okay. We'll be first name through the show, but at the beginning, you earned it. You're getting it.
Okay, that's true. But a dissertation is so different from a book, or at least in my field.
Yeah.
It is, or at least, some of my favorite books in my field, which is literature and media studies, are like strings of articles that are just kind of like, I don't know, jammed together sometimes with an elegant introduction that makes them all vaguely fit under some theme. But this was my first opportunity to really figure out like what a book is, and how to make like a one coherent narrative out of a lot of different ideas. So that that was my hope that I successfully did that. And I'm actually kind of excited to return back to my academic work, thinking like, all right, I know what a book is. Let's revise this with that in mind. So
Well, so this is like a whole new like topic that we got to talk about. And it's funny because usually, it's this show started as a science show 10 years ago when I first started it, and it sort of meandered because of my interests in psychology and social justice and stuff. I've sort of gone down different corridors and avenues, but I usually do talk to authors and scientists about their academic background before we even get into like the current work. So I'm super curious. You media is there like literature? Is there English in there? Like what did you study? And now what is your relationship to academia currently?
okay, well, I'll try to do this concisely, but there is an origin story for my academic work, which is that I wanted to study film, and film is housed in very different departments in the US. Like I was applying to some art history programs, applying to some literature programs, applying to some straight film programs. And I got into this program at Yale that was a dual degree in English literature and film studies. And because I really had no idea what I wanted to do, I thought, ideal, figure it out when I get there. But when I got there, they said, actually, we're film and media studies now, which meant I was like privy and subject to all of these sometimes ponderous, sometimes interesting conversations about like what is media studies? Do we have to make any changes to our curriculum or hiring as a result of being media studies? And the answers were insane. Some people were just like fully candid. We're not going to change anything. You just might be more likely to get a job if it says media studies on your degree. And I was like, incredible. I love bullshit. What's going on here? And so, and there was weird jockeying. There was one professor in the English department who was like, we should be English and media studies because they did like book history. And again, that very question, what is a book, that is kind of plaguing me as I wrote my first one, was of interest to them. And so I actually ended up studying and writing about this concept, the media concept, and how it is that everything we now consume, or sort of all cultural products, have been redefined in terms of media. And like when and how did that happen? And when did media almost come to stand in for culture itself? So it is a project that in some way, I thought it was like completely separate from my puzzle work, you might say. But it turns out that my sort of sometimes very literal fixation on language is like exactly how I ended up organizing the dissertation. So asking really, again, literal, sometimes pedantic questions has led me into some really interesting archives. Like, what's the difference between mass media and mainstream media? And are there like changes in certain industries that led to that distinction that we very rarely talk about mass media now, but we do talk about mainstream media. So it got me into like the history of the FCC and the history of broadcast. And, each chapter sort of functions around a different question like that. So what's the difference between social networking and social media, for example, or, artistic mediums versus mass media, things like that. And the big one, which is the one that actually has real stakes for the discipline and what again goes back to that origin story, is like, what's the difference between communication studies, cultural studies, and media studies? And you'll be hard pressed to find anyone in the academy who can answer that for you, except for me. We don't have to go into that. But media studies is one of the few growth industries in the humanities, as everyone else is shrinking their budgets and their faculty or their tenure lines. Media studies continues to grow, and so the fact that we don't really know what it is, except for a almost advertising term, right? Like, you'll be more likely to get a job if it says media on your CV. Like, again, I'm interested in language, the overdetermination of language, and sometimes it's like hollowness or emptiness, and what kind of like weird cultural capital accrues to certain words, what words become taboo.
Yeah,
These are
yeah.
my preoccupations as a crossword constructor and as an academic.
I love that so much, this idea that these sort of, like, constructs become something larger than what they were originally or maybe not intentionally constructed as, but they really are just constructs. I love too this idea, like now I want to read your dissertation because like I have a lot of peers where I did my
I would hold off
PhD.
until it's a book. Hold off.
I know I've still got to do
You
that
know,
to
it's
mine
that
too.
terrifying thing that dissertations are like available out there somewhere
Yeah,
on the
they're
internet.
published. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, like I went to a psychology only school for my PhD, which is not uncommon for the graduate degree in clinical psychology. And so the only degrees offered by my school were like clinical psych. And I think there's some research psych there. But they also have like media psychology. And I found that a lot of the most interesting dissertations and the most interesting projects happening at my university were in the media department. But it's almost like there was an unstated major premise. That's what your dissertation is. Like they were building on that concept and saying, well, this is how persuasion works, or this is like how people react to these different, things in media. But what is media and how do we define it and how does it actually work is sort of just, you can't do everything in a dissertation. You have to just make certain assumptions and move forward. And it sounds like you really took your time to question and interrogate those assumptions too.
Yeah, I mean that's super interesting. That seems to me like sort of pulling. That's the media that comes from communication studies, which had a whole field of behavioral effects. Right? What are the effects of media? And I mean, I won't get into it now, but that history is so complicated because it really began as a justification for a kind of democratic, or sort of began as democratic propaganda in a lot of ways in a sort of Cold War period, where a lot of research
Yeah.
was being used to essentially say, um, unlike totalitarian propaganda, the American scene, or various outlets, whether it was newspapers or radio or television, was not demonstrating real effects. It wasn't changing people's voting patterns. It wasn't changing their consumer habits. There's a lot of reasons for why that research showed up that way. Partially, it's because there was a much larger kind of consensus among American consumers. This is like a time of high liberalism, where even liberalism was sort of like the center of the spectrum, of the political spectrum, included so many people that, like, yeah, whatever journalism is going to produce is not going to nudge people in any one or other direction, because the realm of consensus is so large. But that isn't to say that, like, the way the press operates in the US versus, say, the Soviet Union is actually that different. But these scholars were saying that it really was, in order to say, the United States is not a totalitarian state. So that
Right.
emerged. That's like why. And they got a lot of funding for that research, because everyone
Mhm.
loved to hear that, right? Loved to hear that the U.S. isn't totalitarian. But as we know now from like our current media environment, um, you know, these forms of propaganda can have tremendous effects on the public sphere. So blah blah
Yeah.
blah. Anyway,
Oh, it's so
um,
interesting. And of course, like I mean, I'm jumping way ahead here, but like the field that you now work in, not the academic field, but like your day job.
yeah.
What are you are you an editor? What's your title? Are you a
Okay, yeah. No,
constructor?
I do a bunch of stuff.
Mhm.
So in the fall, I'm going to start a tenure track job at Cornell in media studies and English literature.
Mhm.
And I also, for a long time was a humanities and film editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books. And throughout all of this, I've written crossword puzzles. And I started out, well, we can get into how I started out, but after college, I worked for Will Shortz and was writing puzzles primarily for the Times. And a few years later, I got asked to help start the New Yorker puzzle. So now I write um, two puzzles a month for the New Yorker, and that section has grown tremendously. It started out just a small handful of us making crosswords for their website, and then some got pulled into print, and they've now diversified into like a whole puzzles and game universe that
Mhm.
I mean, we were just talking about fields that are expanding and contracting in different industries. Like the puzzles and games world is expanding. It's been really fascinating and wonderful to see them hire so much, but especially when I have other friends who are journalists who can't get a job.
Right.
It's interesting that's, I mean, it's not coincidental. I think it's a big moneymaker for, um, everyone sort of following the lead of the Times, where that even though the New Yorker doesn't have like a separate subscription for puzzles and games the way the Times does, I think there are a number of reasons why puzzles and games is attractive to these types of publications. So we can get
Oh,
into it
for
if you want,
sure.
but yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I could see, like, obviously we can understand from like a business perspective, but we can also understand from like a larger sort of zeitgeist perspective, like why people want to escape into games right now and why,
yeah,
if you've always been somebody who's a news consumer, you're having to sort of let me see if I can come up with the right word. Um temper's maybe the wrong word, but budget the amount of time you spend consuming the news and break it up with things that are like less existentially threatening. And I think that puzzles
totally.
are a good way to do that.
Well, so the history of the puzzle is so interesting in this way. Like there are all these inflection points. So the puzzle was invented in 1913, um, and then was not sort of institutionalized at the time until 1942. And so you see like the wars in general,
Mhm.
and the kind of social agony around the realities of war informing like the existence of puzzles in everyone's life, and they're sort of and we saw a huge uptick again during COVID of people being like, it's time for another puzzle renaissance, right? Because
Yeah,
it's a strange distraction that really occupies your mind, and while also um, sort of distracting it from anxious thought. It's the first
totally.
crossword editor, the first puzzle editor of the New York Times, this woman Margaret Farrer, who I hope we can talk about more if you want. She used to say, you can't think of your troubles while solving a crossword puzzle. But what was also strange was that the Times like historically held off introducing crossword puzzles because they thought it was like a gateway to more debased forms like comics and classifieds. Um, but it was maybe apocryphally the publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, was going to the Herald Tribune and buying it every day at the start of the war because he wanted to be solving crossword puzzles, which they had. So he's finally like, we should introduce this into our own puzzle. But again, with that sort of sense that the time should have a more sophisticated puzzle, or including phrases and words that were only fit to print, an idea that has transformed over time. But she was at this sort of uh, she had this sort of dual imperative, and I think kind of conflicting motives. On the one hand, you're not supposed to think of your troubles, and on the other hand, it's supposed to be a sort of sophisticated and timely representation of um, of what are words that would be interesting to the Times as news consumer. And so it actually turned out that her puzzles were filled with references to the war, oddly, even though they're not
Of
supposed to be.
course.
It's supposed to
Yeah.
be a
Yeah.
distraction from the war. So, um, and I remember like putting elbow bump in a crossword puzzle around the time of COVID. And now just even hearing that phrase, I'm like drawn back to this horrible time, elbow bump. Right. But like, does it draw you into thinking about the current moment that you're trying to distract yourself from, or does it effectively distract you from it? I don't know. It's always been an interesting question, or at least in at least at the Times it has been.
Well, and almost like also not just, I guess, distract, but also sort of make light or
Yes.
normalize
Oh
it
my
a
God.
little
Right.
bit.
Right. How do you make a like cute, funny clue for elbow bump when there's like mass
Right.
death going around you? It's really,
Yeah, it's
really
like
strange project. Yeah.
because we do, like, it's when there's mass death happening around you, whether it be war or, a disease, you it's just becomes normal, and it's not that you fully become numb to it, but it is your reality, and so then, yes, you have to find absurdity in those moments. There's also, like, a weird thing where we are all consumed. Like COVID is a perfect example for those of us who have never lived through a war like the Second or First World War, because w- w- we can read about these things and we can watch films about them, but like those of us who only know sort of like war in the Middle East aren't really understanding what it's like when the entire country was consumed by the war. And so, even though, like you said, it's all consuming, you're also, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but during the first two world wars and also like during COVID, you also weirdly end up with a lot more time on your hands because it's all consuming, because it's like a singular focus as opposed to having a lot of other things going on in your life. And I think when you find yourself being singular focused on one thing, you you are capable of more leisure pursuits, which is like a weird paradox.
Yeah, and even just whether the puzzle is obviously leisurely, but it also produces this kind of weird work feeling,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
it is intellectual labor. But I think as
Yeah,
opposed
that
to
you're
the
like
sort of
craving.
like
Yeah.
yeah, and as opposed to the kind of like endless work that has become normal in our economy, the never not working feeling. I think the fact that you can like complete a puzzle, or like solve it to completion, as opposed to feeling like you can never actually finish your work. I think that's like maybe particularly satisfying.
Gosh, I
Um,
can't always solve them to completion. I'm like certain days of the week I can, but not others. I struggle with that
yeah.
for sure. But yeah, you're right. There
Well,
is this like
going back to
yeah.
the like advertising or the question of why this is such good business for
Mhm.
magazines and newspapers is that there are certain, um, there's a subscription model um, for certain papers and magazines. But if their main revenue source is advertising, a lot of web ads like actually, they'll want to buy into some like something that's going to be on a browser that people will stay on for a very long time, right? So you can like charge more for ads on puzzle pages because people spend a lot of time on them, more time than just running through an article, or
Oh yeah,
essay.
I can
So
attest to
that's also
that. I
good
mean,
business.
Wordle
Yeah,
is
exactly.
always
Yeah,
open in my browser. It's
right.
like the only browser page that's always open because I don't want to retype it every day. So I just go back to
Yeah,
it and as soon as it refreshes at midnight or whatever, then I can play a new game. But it's always open. They're probably making tons of money off of advertising for that.
yeah. I mean, there's so many different like, just in the course of promoting this book, I've thought through so many different like kind of dystopian fantasies about the future of the crossword puzzle. Um, I mean, this is mostly because people want to ask about AI and crossword constructing, which is a very interesting
Oh god, I
theme.
didn't even think about that.
Well, we can get there if you want, but one of the kind of dystopian futures is that actually people will pay to have some product actually represented in a puzzle. The reason why like that those white squares would actually be advertising space. The reason why I even started thinking in those terms is because the words that are or aren't included in a crossword puzzle have become like incredibly politically charged for a number of reasons. But like I've been asked to and have ultimately taken certain words out of puzzles, including like the NRA or just NRA, because even if you clue it in a way that is not an endorsement of them, even just including them, including that organization in a puzzle, is drawing people's attention to it. Is this kind of, whether it's an endorsement, it's still prominence or perhaps even advertising in a way. Um, and there's also, people don't want to see, I haven't taken it out of my word list. We can talk about word lists if you want, but there are certain constructors I know who have taken the word Trump out of their word list, and not even if it's clued as a verb, right? Like to trump
Oh, yeah.
something.
I mean, like, I'm doing
But
that with my own language. Like, I'll say, blah, 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 Trump's whatever, and then I'm like, damn it, I can't use that word anymore.
right, exactly. People
Yeah.
are like, I just don't even want to see those letters
Yeah.
in adjacency. No, thank you. So what makes for a good word all of a sudden also has not all of a sudden, it's always had political effects. But right now it feels like it's a particularly contentious topic in what we sometimes call the cross world.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of sort of like after a horrible mass shooting, this like journalistic ethic that I still don't think the media is great at following, but, like, not naming the shooter, right? Like, this person wants notoriety. Like, we don't wanna put their name in print, or we don't wanna say their name out loud. We just wanna say "the shooter" and not give them their sort of, hero status that they've been seeking. I feel like it's a similar thing. Like, there's a lot of kind of socio-political currency to a word, and we've got to be careful about where we put them because that whole like no even bad press is still press. Like you have a lot of power in constructing a crossword because you're then triggering or reminding people of a concept, of a whole topic, of a whole politic, whatever, and bringing them along. Good, bad, neutral. It's sort of not that it doesn't matter, but like it has a lot of power.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole cohort of us who have been working to like diversify the words that appear in a crossword puzzle and have been thinking about how to diversify the field of constructors who at this point are like overwhelmingly white men, a demographic that has actually changed. It used to be overwhelmingly white women who wrote crossword puzzles, white all the way down, we should say. And there are interesting theories as to why that is. But I think we often, I can just speak for myself, I feel self-conscious about like politicizing a pastime, right? But at the same time, it's so obviously a political project to be patrolling or negotiating the bounds of common knowledge, right? Like, what is common knowledge? What deserves a place in this sort of pantheon of common knowledge? What can we expect people to know? Is it pedagogical, actually? Should we be pushing people to know certain things that is, and actually actively expanding what types of
Right. Yeah.
information we should be holding in common? I mean, it is inevitably political, and language is inevitably political. So sometimes we're actively drawing attention to that, and some solvers don't like it, right? I had a friend who put reparations in a puzzle, and on the comment section, there were all sorts of curmudgeons who were like, I don't want politics in my puzzle. And it's like, well, what you want to solve and what you know is inevitably political. I don't know what to tell you.
And also it's interesting too because it shows the power of politicization. Like I see this a lot in science communication where we'll talk about a concept that is, in my view just a scientific concept. It is. We know that it is. We've studied it and
Right.
it how the world is. And then people will be like, stop politicizing. And I'm like, we're not making this political. Like it has become
Yeah.
political. Climate change is a great example, or, anti-vax
Yeah.
or whatever. Like, but we
Yeah.
know that is, vaccines work and blah, blah, blah. And so that's like also a really interesting thing. If somebody sees the word reparations and then they're like, don't politicize my puzzle. And it's like, it's a
Right.
word,
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And it's
Yeah.
not
And when words
necessarily
become
inherently political, it's political because of your relationship to it.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And this gets into like not only who a puzzle is for, right? Like who the imagined audience of your solver is and what you should or could expect them to know, but also what a
Right, like
puzzle
the
is
word
for. Like if it's,
egads, by the
yeah,
way, so sorry to interrupt,
yeah,
but that fucking
yeah, no,
word makes
do
me
get in there.
insane. I hate the word egads, and I used to get so frustrated when I would do puzzles, like and I'm talking maybe 10, 20 years ago when I was working for a neuropsychologist right after, like, undergrad, and the admin was really into I don't even remember which puzzle she did, but she did it every day, and I would sit with her and do it, and I feel like every other day egads was in that puzzle, and I was like, "What even is this?" And she's like, "It's an old people word." I was like, "It's not
Totally.
a word people
There's this
use."
amazing. Yeah, no, exactly. And so if part of the project of the puzzle is to like prove to you every day that you're very good at solving a Times crossword puzzle, right? Then like egads is totally a great word to put in a puzzle. But reparations isn't, right? Because
Right.
that's not part of the project of just showing you every single day that you're very good at solving a Times crossword puzzle. It's a different project, right? So,
Ah, it's so
and
frustrating because actually I
yeah,
feel dumber when those kinds of like puzzle isms are in a puzzle, because it's like that's not common knowledge to me because I'm not like a puzzler. I just sometimes do
yeah.
puzzles.
By the
And
way,
so,
the word puzzleism is great. The word that we tend to use is crosswordese. So
oh, I love it. I
now
love it.
you
Oh, it's so great.
know. Yeah.
We know what each other are talking
Um,
about. I love it. That's so funny. But yeah,
yeah.
it's like there are certain things that are obviously there because they're good. Not what do you call them? There's probably a name for it, not a filler word, but a word that is like an interesting
Yeah. No
combination of
filler.
letters.
That's right. Yeah. It's filler is great, like, or the whole thing is fill, but it is a word that's there, probably crosswordese, right? It's a word that's there because it helps the constructor with the crossings and therefore is like way more frequently seen in crossword puzzles than in everyday speech. Um, there's an incredible story of this woman named Rachel Fabi, who's a great constructor. And she wanted to put the celebrity makeup tutorial artist Nikki DeJager in a crossword puzzle, or just DeJager, I think was what she included. Um, and she's a trans woman who, I don't know, I went down a whole rabbit hole on the internet watching so many of her tutorials, which are delightful. And also seeing her like impeccably draped Met Gala gown. Like she clearly has celebrity, right? Just not to the average Times crossword construct or crossword solver, I suppose, or that was at least what the editors at that paper decided, and asked her to actually change it from Dowager to Dowager. Um, and so she wrote back and basically said, like, I've had to learn who Isao Aoki is, or however you say his name, right? Like a golfer with with incredible number of vowels, which has no relevance to her everyday life. She's not particularly interested in golf stars. It's not even, I don't even know how successful or how contemporary Isao Aoki is as a golfer, but he's been in crossword puzzles forever. And she's sort of saying, like, why can't it's more important to me to have trans representation in a crossword puzzle, or the name of a trans woman who's uh, in many ways like objectively famous. If you're invited to the Met Gala and you have however million numbers of views on your makeup tutorials, how do we prove her celebrity when the initial impulse was like by the paper and the and its test solvers was like, I don't need to, nor should I need to learn the name of Lager, right? It's like, well, should the puzzle adapt over time to, or is the fact that she's a trans woman and that Rachel wanted trans representation in the puzzle, like, should that be a priority for the editing team?
And or just that like maybe the gatekeepers shouldn't be the same crusty old people. Like, can the gatekeeping itself, because there's always gonna be a certain amount of gatekeeping, right? There's always gonna be a certain amount of, like, we are the curators, we are the people who decide, what is popular, what is known, what is right for our audience. I mean, that curation is gonna constantly happen, but shouldn't that be evolving to be more inclusive? It's never going to if the same people are saying, "No, the golfer stays."
The golfer stays. Yeah, I mean, there's also been a number of like indie puzzles that have cropped up, including queer crosswords. The crosswords is also spelled with a Q. I don't know how to register that like visual pen
Yeah.
over
On a
audio, but
podcast, yeah.
yeah. And those outlets are have a lot more, to recognize their audience within a certain kind of political orientation, or in this case a sexual orientation. Like it allows them to like understand their public and to cater to it. The Times is much more complicated, right? Because so I used to work for Will Shortz. And this is where the idea of mainstreamness is really complicated, and it's really double-edged, because on the one hand, Shorts used to talk about certain things as being niche, right? So like anything that was like explicitly woman coded or queer coded or
Oh my
black
God.
coded slang
Wait, women
would be like
coded? Like,
niche,
so
right?
50% of the population was niche?
Right, exactly. Like it's infuriating when you think about it, when something is called niche. I remember I tried to put intersectional in a puzzle, and he's like, no one's gonna know that.
Oh my God. No, only the white men who do your puzzle won't know it. Everyone else will.
Right,
Jeez.
right. But so at the same time, he did have a democratic goal in mind, which is like, I want the most number of people to be able to solve my puzzle. And so anything that had sort of like was accented in a certain way for a certain public, again, we're still talking about 50% of the population in the case of women, but anything that was accented was seen as niche. But what that was for the purpose of, of catering to the largest possible audience. Think about like the big three TV networks before the invention of cable. That was operating under the same premise, right? That like our audience is unmarked, right? Which ends up meaning white and male and straight, right?
Totally. Yeah,
But
that's the issue,
the
because there's
idea
an
that it's,
implicit bias
yeah,
there. Yeah.
right, yeah. So it ends up instituting this sort of tacit policy of exclusion. But the goal is actually inclusivity. And so it's just like how to convince these editors that that's not actually inclusive, right? That it's actually instituting a policy of exclusion. That's been the work of a lot of us. And the puzzles are changing as a result. And like, I apologize to the, commenters on crossword blogs who hate to see it, but like, puzzles are changing. So for better, I think. But then at the same time, you end up getting a situation where like, and this is a function of how puzzles are made now. They're made with these word lists that, and we should move more slowly through this. But like, if a word is included in a Times puzzle, it will automatically go in a word list that is downloaded by constructors, which they use to train their algorithms for
Right.
use in
Okay.
crossword puzzle constructing software. But then you'll get a situation where like, I don't know, your white uncle is saying like, it's lit, or like eyebrows on fleek in their puzzle. And you're like, wait a sec, is this just cultural appropriation, or are we actually diversifying and expanding the bounds of common knowledge in a productive way? Does that make sense? The kind of double-edgedness of that?
It does, but I also like, I
You're
struggle
like,
with
whatever.
yeah, I guess I struggle with the idea that somebody is appropriating something by understanding it. Like, he doesn't have to say
Right.
it. You know what I mean? Like, he's writing it
Right.
down.
No,
Like,
totally.
it's observational. So yeah, and I guess the other idea here is like not a bigger issue, but a parallel issue of sort of the control of media as a whole. And obviously, this is probably like something that you've grappled with so much because of your research. But this idea that, like, if you give the people steak, they'll eat steak. If you give the people ground beef, that's what they're going to eat. Like this, is it our job to sort of elevate the discourse? Is it our job to teach people new words? Or when we want to, quote, cater to the masses, does that water down and work towards the lowest common denominator? And as a science communicator, that's something that is like a huge internal conversation all the time among SciComm groups. Like, how do we make science accessible without like undermining the actual science of it all? Like, we don't want to water it down so much that it's no longer true. We don't want to make it oversimplified. And so I used to, like, when I worked in television, I would really struggle with producers who, if I was interviewing a scientist on camera, they would be like, well, just dumb it down. I'm like, I would have to always stop them and be like, let me handle this. And because the scientists would get really offended by that. And it's like, I don't want you to dumb it down. I want you to understand that I might not have the same vocabulary as you. So we need to find common words. But I don't think that the audience is too stupid to understand the concepts. They just don't have the vocabulary. But you are actually in the field of vocabulary. So that's a fascinating
Totally right. There's like no syntax. There's no syntax to a crossword puzzle. It's
yeah.
literally just like, should these words be known or not? And how much is sort of like it's a very politically charged thing to say, to call something jargon, right? Because what you're saying is
Mm-hmm.
it's not worth knowing for, or that it's only worth knowing to a specialized community.
Right. Or you're not
Um,
smart
but,
enough
yeah,
to need it in your regular vocabulary.
right.
That,
But like,
that's powerful to say.
yeah, especially when so much of what's considered jargon from an academic or from a, in the humanities has to do with, um, like, I don't know, I don't want to call out individuals in my life, but I've been told before that, like, mass incarceration, what jargon, and it's like,
Right, right. Or
I think
benign
it's kind of
sexism. Like that's jargon. Like,
right.
no, that's just my everyday
Exactly, exactly.
experience. Yeah.
Right, exactly, exactly. So often there's a kind of resistance to it at the level of the signifier, right, at the level of language, but it betrays a larger resistance to the concept or even having the idea of um, injustice like brought to your attention. The rejection of it is not the fact of the injustice. The initial rejection is the word itself, right? So I've had to think so much about watering down ideas in because this book is for a commercial audience, right? So I'm an academic by training. I am used to writing for other academics, but this book is HarperCollins, right? So it's meant for a large audience, and I'm really grateful that I didn't have to change even the language I'm using in the book, because what I wanted to be writing about is actually, I can step back for a second and say this book is about a number of things. One is the changing demographic of crossword constructors, that the puzzle really used to be women's work and became a community of solvers, or a community of constructors where I'm one of very few women who do it right now. 80% of constructors are still male, and I just came back from the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament, which was a delight, but with zero exceptions, the top solvers were all men. Stella Sawastowski was brilliant, but she was not in the very top.
But you said a couple times that historically this was like women's work. And I think of like, maybe it's a silly, incorrect parallel, but I think of like Bletchley Park and sort of like, encryption and coding. And we all think of Turing, but we don't think of this like army of women who are actually doing all of this work.
It's totally parallel. So
Okay.
we'll just start out by saying that in the very beginning, the crossword puzzle was not only mostly created by women, but it was also very perverse. And those women were, for the most part, some of the very first college educated women in the country, right? But who were then expected, which is to say, like white, middle class, or upper class, full of social privilege, but then still expected once they got their college degree to be in the home, right? And to be mothers and wives first. And maybe they had like a few years before they were married as teachers, right? But
Right, to get it out of their system. Yeah.
to get into their system, exactly. But they're overeducated for their positions, and so they were writing crossword puzzles in part to just like keep their minds active and perhaps some sort of outlet for their intelligence, and maybe even to have a job that was in publishing but didn't mark them as a career woman, because there's also just social stigma around that. But it was also strangely associated in the cultural imagination with first wave feminism and with flappers and new women. There's all this strange ephemera, like novelty songs and postcards and comics that feature what were sometimes called crossword mamas, women whose sort of desires to date and work and maybe even fuck were like as inscrutable to patriarchy as the new crossword puzzle itself. There's like literally this song called Crossword Mama where the chorus ends, crossword mama, you puzzle me, but Papa's gonna figure you out, right? It's like very much displaced anxiety about first wave feminism onto the crossword puzzle, and like cartoons in which women are like, struggling over a puzzle, having abdicated the maternal function. Their like emasculated husbands are having to take care of the crying baby. Like it's clearly the crossword puzzle was like siphoning off all of their attention from the home. And allegedly there were like many divorces, a spate of divorces in the mid 1920s, with one legal aid lawyer suggesting that he had 60 requests for divorces in 1 week from men whose wives had caught crossword puzzleitis, right? So there's this kind of like, I mean, it's completely not. It's fascinating, but it's clearly a way of negotiating women's intelligence and the sort of activation of women's intelligence, and during this time of changing demographics. But then when you move up through the history, the very same women who have these college degrees and are yet expected to go to the home are the same ones that become recruited for the early cryptanalysts and computing jobs during World War II. In fact, the U.S. government, not allegedly, I mean, Liza Mundy has this great book called Code Girls. The U.S. government asked two questions when recruiting women from elite colleges to be working on the earliest, working on ENIAC. And the first was, do you like crossword puzzles? And the second was, are you married? Right. And if your answer was yes and no, then you got the job. So yeah, there's clearly an overlap between the idea that this was women's work that could be selectively used to help in the war effort, but that it was not meant to turn women into career women, right? Because so many of those women after the war were basically pushed out of their work back into the home for reasons that actually have a lot to do with the second factor that has sort of masculinized the industry, which is that, on the one hand, labor demographics did change. More women entered the workforce. When do they have time? They're still expected to take care of house and home. When do they have time to do this rarefied, underpaid puzzle work? But also the invention of crossword constructing software in the 90s and early aughts meant that a lot of people became interested in crossword puzzles and making crossword puzzles as this kind of natural language processing question. Like, can computers make crosswords better than people can? And so based on the sort of biases and prejudices of type culture, those tended to be men. But the other thing that's worth saying, and I wish this were like a blanket statement that everyone, or a blanket sort of fact that everyone knew. When we ask, can computers do this work better than a human can? We're most often asking, can computers do this work better than a woman can? Because the kind of work that computers do has historically been women's work, whether it is like clerical, or in the case of crossword constructors, it's literally the weaving with language that was historically seen as women's work. And I use that term
because women were seen as computers, right? Like that's,
exactly
it's
right. Yeah.
Tabulation, you just sit down and you just push the paper, but don't make any big executive decisions because that might hurt your female brain.
Totally. Yeah, no, totally. And it was explicitly sex typed in the world of computing, right? Like women had nimble fingers and then could therefore run, could therefore do the encoding and running the sort of ticker tape through the machine better than men could, right? But that's a very low estimation of what kind of work women could do. So, for so many reasons that I think I listed at least three, we get to a place right now where very few, I mean, it's changing, it is expanding, but we're still seeing 80% of this. I just saw a tweet that said something like 18% of the Times puzzles from this year were made by women.
Wow. So it's in some ways worse than a lot of science fields.
Exactly. Yeah, it really is. It really is. It is strange, especially when you look at solvers who are, it's pretty 50-50. And anecdotally, every time I've talked to anyone about my book, they always say oh, my grandmother loved crossword puzzles. It's very rarely my grandfather.
Well, and that's the thing that pisses me off the most. It's whether historically it was more women or not, because that's anecdotal, but regardless, if the numbers are 50-50 going back, why are, quote, women specific words niche? Like,
Right.
that's the
Oh,
part that
exactly. Yeah,
really
totally.
frustrates me, is this like implicit bias that the sort of ideal audience is the quote apolitical, normalized, whatever, the sort of chosen audience of the New York Times or whoever we're talking about, which is, without saying it, a white Protestant straight cis man. Somehow those people are inherently apolitical is the frustrating part, because what you're really saying is those people have the privilege to not have to be involved in politics. And I think that's the part that like goes without saying. It's like when I'm swiping on a dating app and somebody says apolitical, to me that's like more offensive than somebody that's like overtly conservative. I'm like, nope, like
No, yeah,
say I'm a white
totally.
guy who's never had to face anything in my life without saying it. Say I'm apolitical. Like, you have the privilege
Totally.
to not be political.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's what we call a red flag.
And I think it's so sad that like it's so obvious. Like, I'm sitting here trying to like, oh, I'm not going to use that expression, beat a dead horse. It's so gross. But I'm sitting here trying to like make it really explicit. And you're like, yeah, of course, of course, of course, of course. But like, there's probably people listening right now who are like, huh, I never put
Yeah,
those two things
yeah. I
together.
mean, so the anxiety that what we're doing is like politicizing the crossword. It's pretty easy for me to like, I don't know, reject or repudiate that idea, and also like sort of uh, allay my doubts or my fears that what I'm doing is like not a good look, at least, because it's like, shouldn't this be fun? um, because that's something that, at multiple levels, that's something that feminists have heard from for a long time, right? That you're politicizing something that shouldn't be political, which is to say that like the ballot box is the place for politics, but um, not the home, and not the places and occupations that produce leisure for the worker. That those should be not political places, right? So we hear that all the time. We also hear the idea that we're like humorless, which
Right.
is,
And that our basically that our tits and our vaginas and our uteruses are like inherently political. Like, no, they're just my body parts.
right, right. But then on the
It's
other
like
hand,
just
there's,
being.
yeah, right, yeah, no, I know. I mean, I do think at this point, and well, I do think that just being a woman is political based on
Right.
just
Yeah.
based
For
on
me, you're right. For
um,
me, like the political is the personal is the political. But like, I didn't do that. You know what I mean? Like, I
right.
was
No, of course,
politicized.
I'm not
Yeah.
right. I'm not politicizing X, Y, or Z, including the crossword puzzle. Right? Language is political. You know, a woman and women's and trans people's bodies are political, and that's not because that's because they have been politicized, not because they are inherently political. But then when we try to draw attention to their political nature, people get upset because they're like, this isn't the ballot box, keep politics out of it.
That goes back to their sort of privilege of like, well, I don't want to think about things that eke me out, or I don't want to think about things that challenge my privilege or my authority or my power. Those things are they make me feel icky. And I don't want you to confront me with things that make me feel icky. I'd rather just
Right.
sit in
Well,
the
and
dark.
especially, I mean, the idea that a crossword puzzle in particular shouldn't make you feel icky, like, there's an interesting history to that, which is that the first editor of the Times Crossword, Margaret Farrar, she instituted what is sometimes called the Times breakfast test, or the crossword puzzle breakfast test, which is that there should be no um, reference to the body or to sex or to disease in the crossword puzzle, because it shouldn't turn the solver's stomach over breakfast, right? But
Wow.
yeah, so that has that, but what is what constitutes the breakfast test, I think, has expanded as it's now become not only like disease or sex, but it's also like, I don't know, reparations or Trump, or like it just
Yeah,
feels like it's
identity, just like
expansive.
identity in
Yeah,
general.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Ugh.
Um, to me, it's fascinating. To me, it again like draws attention to how political it's always been, because if you're you're deeming what is and isn't appropriate to think about every single day at breakfast. Like, what could be more political than that, right? Um, what should enter the home is really the question. Like, what is worthy of thinking about, and what isn't, and what is a appropriate use of brain power and not an appropriate use of brain power. It's like these have always been. I don't know. These are questions that fascinate me. Um,
Yeah. And, like, what rattles the safety of your cage, I think. What
totally,
is what
totally, yeah.
allows me to just ignore and to, it's like you think about where we are right now post-COVID, but with what's going on in Gaza, and, it's like there are things that I'm sure that crossword producers or consumers or editors or whatever would use the breakfast test. For a lot of people, it's like, well, I am lucky enough that it's not a part of my everyday life, so I don't wanna have to think about it because it makes me uncomfortable, and it's like that's just, like, the highest form of privilege, and, like, almost acting victimized, like you're accosting me by putting the word Gaza in a puzzle, like, "Wait, what? You're the victim now?"
I got in a little bit of trouble, not with my editors. My editors were great, but just on like Twitter, because I include Negev not as a desert in Israel, but as a desert in Palestine. Um, and some solvers were pissed,
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
recognize the existence of Palestine.
Yeah. Totally. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all. And that's like there is I don't know, I can't walk away from personally because I have a little bit of a platform. It's not huge, but it exists, and you obviously have a platform as well, and our platforms are all different, but I feel a moral imperative to not sanitize or a moral imperative to not maintain the patriarchy or maintain the sheen of, like, comfort for people who have always been comfortable and who have never had to face the reality of discomfort for so many people. Like, confronting the comfortable with the discomfort of reality feels like a moral, necessity. And it's not like I'm doing it to be cruel, I'm doing it to be honest.
Yeah, no, of course. I think the question of play is one though that complicates my work a little bit. So there's a big chapter in my book that's about the idea that wordplay is political, and it stems back to sort of a um, a sort of feminist tradition and from France that was actually suggesting, among other things, that basically distorting, playing on the kind of the excessive signifying power of language, that it sort of really is beyond our control, that could be disruptive of patriarchy, which always wants to control language. But they were actively using like puns and wordplay to fuck with patriarchy, and they were totally serious about it. I'm talking about people like Luce Irigaray and Aline Sixou, these French, Lacanian feminists who were totally inspiring to me when I encountered them in college, in part because I was already fucking with language and trying to imagine what kind of feminist I could be. But you also have to step back and be like, were they serious? Like, are they joking? We're actually like making puns on the idea of labia, and that's our politics. It's
Right.
the lips that speak the lips that speak as one is like, is that it is are we going to be alienating more people than we are actually going to be bringing them into like sisterly solidarity with these kind of like arcane, uh, hyper intellectual, abstract forms of language play? Like, can this actually be political? And I think about that when I'm writing clues. If my project is like explicitly to diversify and to draw out the politics of language in my word list, I then find sometimes that I've set myself up with a really crazy project, which is like, how do I make a kind of playful clue for like race science? Like
Right.
what am
Yeah.
what task have I set myself with? And I still believe in it, and I still try to do it, but it's so different from what it was like when I started out writing crossword puzzles, and I was writing them by hand, and I was the whole project was just like, can I get words to cross in my graph paper notebook? It couldn't be more different than the kinds of, which has, had nothing to do with the content of words, really. Like, I was just trying to get any words and that were so called like real words and not crosswordese to just intersect in my notebook. Didn't matter what they meant. Now it's like become not all, but really mostly about meaning, and the kind of ethics of determining what words are and aren't puzzle worthy, or what is or isn't common knowledge. It's just such a far cry from where I began with this work.
Well, and I've got to ask, I mean, we're sort of, I told you we'd go 45 minutes. It's like 59 minutes already. But like, I've got to ask, like,
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me of like the Disney of it all, that there's this sort of part of play that's quite absurdist where, in old Disney movies, there were a lot of things, and I think you still see it a lot today. I don't know. I don't watch them because I don't have kids, but like, things that were like explicitly just for the adults that luckily,
Yeah.
because of being a child, you wouldn't get it. So it could be included because it would be over your head. And sometimes I feel like that with sort of political play, that like the wokeness of it all, like there's a way to include something that, it's dog whistling, that like certain people are going to get and they're going to know it's for them. And other people, they won't even notice it. And that's like an interesting, weird form of political play as well. Do you ever grapple with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to think of dog whistling as play, but I actually think that's right. Um, and it's part of why, like, the I don't know, politics of like comedy at this moment, and like, is trolling
Yeah,
genuinely funny, you
I
know?
know. Yeah.
And are there, is there, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how to answer your, your provocation here, because it's like, on the one hand, I just feel like now is maybe we should return to literalism, like,
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm not sure there's like maybe I should just clue race science as like, uh, you know, pernicious form of, experimentation on Black people's bodies. I don't know,
Right. And
like,
just be
it's
really
not that
straight with
there's
it.
nothing, be really straight with it.
Because we know there's a huge
But
percentage of the
yeah,
population who aren't operating at that level, for whom, critical race theory, they don't know what that is. And it's bad to them, and it's just like there's so little information there and it's all propaganda and like no
yeah,
critical thought
yeah,
about it.
totally. Totally. I mean, there's one woman I write about in my book. Her name is Julia Penelope, and she was a linguist and, an English professor, and she taught some of the very first women's literature courses in the country. And she was also, by the end of her life, like a very avid lesbian separatist, and which led her into some really gross, turkey places. But she also was writing what she called lesbian separatist crossword puzzles that were explicitly pedagogical. She's like, this is my classroom. And they were like footnotes attached to her clues, in a way like you couldn't solve them unless your feminist consciousness was already raised, but like they were meant to be sort of instructive, and like, this is one way to learn. Um, and so I think, as much as I don't want to like reproduce her politics because they were abhorrent by the end of her life, and she was very literal minded. A woman is a woman is a woman in the most sort of reductive and
Ah,
essentialist way.
yeah.
She was also at the same time like very aware that um, that language is our most political object. And so I don't know. She again, like, draws out one of these double binds in the book, which is like, um, there is really no way to contain language, to control it. It's a fantasy that we have. And the crossword puzzle is this weird site where, on the one hand, you're like, there is a right answer. And so it does seem like we're like taming the polysemy, the like polymorphic perverseness of language. And on the other hand, we're like totally unleashing it by drawing out all the forms of play and um, and like playing on all of its double meanings in order to write the clues. And so it kind of ends up being this intensified site for both the problem of the desire to control language and the inability to do so. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to it in the first place, because that project of like wanting to tame something that's untamable was what really drew me into the project, and to the pastime when I was a 15-year-old. But also as I've gotten older and in many ways more political, I've been really kind of obsessed with this idea that there is such thing as common knowledge or common sense, and that pins down words, whether it's like whether you know what they mean or not. It's like critical race theory, that's outside of common sense. But of course there's like just the evolution of language, the uncontrollableness of it is, I don't know, it's like what draws me to all sorts of work.
I love that, and the shift of the zeitgeist as well. I mean, um, I I don't know if you've seen it, but I highly recommend there's this series that I just I'm like a documentary sucker, and I just watched this series on, I think it was on Hulu, called, like, The Dark Side of Comedy, which on its surface is, like, a little bit of a performative sort of, like, I don't know, like, you feel a little bit icky because it's like each episode is about a different comic and their struggles, and some of them are people who died by suicide, and some of them are people who OD'd, but, who had different, like, intense struggles in their lives that maybe weren't completely public. A fair amount of them are still living and are still thriving, and, but it, like, and they're included in the documentary. But one of the things that I don't think was intentional, or maybe it was completely intentional, but it's sort of an undercurrent of the documentary, was this display of the shift in the zeitgeist that you saw during like the 70s counterculture when George Carlin and Richard Pryor were like these big stand-ups. Doing their play was inherently liberal and political, and it was because the country during Vietnam had this sort of general uh, view that was very anti-war and that was quite, progressive. And then you saw the Andrew Dice Clays coming in the 80s during like the Reagan era and then comedy became very cruel. And a lot of the biggest comics at the time were just like punching down and shitting on, you know, um, marginalized people. And so it is really interesting that there's an ebb and a flow that happens politically with the entire country, but then there's these pockets within it that are always sort of bubbling up.
I keep coming back to this in my mind, just coming back to this figure of the troll and like how, um, I don't know, are trolls like inherently conservative? Is that just like a thing? Is that because obviously at some level I want to be thinking like, well, those comics that are punching down, I'm sure that they justified it by like people can't take a joke.
Oh, totally. Yeah, this was like the beginning of like the whole cancel culture outrage. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's been really strange. I'm sure for this is true of like progressive comics as well. Um, that like, where to draw the line between being self-serious and being serious. It's something that I have to think about all the time, and both in writing this book and also um, in writing puzzles in general. It's like, okay, I want to acknowledge the seriousness of the politics of language, and I also don't want to be self-seriousness and overstate the importance of or the either my own work or the work of the puzzle in general. Because at the end of the day, like it is a fucking game.
Yeah, I love that distinction. I think that's important. It's something in my work, as a psychologist, but specifically I practice existential psychology. There's that, existential, it's like life is so heavy, so you have to have like absurdity. Like all existential philosophy is punctuated by like deep absurdity. It's just you need that kind of yin and yang. And you wouldn't think so. You would think it would all just be really heavy, but it's not. It's there's so much play.
Yeah, and I know I it's kind of why I there's something about these French feminists that I was talking about that really appeals to me because they were using play and jokes, honestly, like jokes about the way that the double meaning of dépenser, which is both like to spend and to unthink. You're like, what if we just what if we're kind of like profligate with language, and in so doing, we like unthink all of the, the sort of mental cages of patriarchy. And it's like, okay, you're making a joke, right? You're making a play on words here. But at the same time, you're asking us to take language really seriously. And I don't exactly know. When you read some of this stuff, you're like, are they taking themselves too seriously? Isn't it super easy to ridicule them as just like, I don't know, being all into their own intelligence and anything else? But they just like would not be embarrassed by their project. And I think it's
I
kind
feel
of a,
yeah. I feel the same way when I read existential philosophy. It's the same way. It's so funny. It's like so up their own asses, but at the same time, it's like, they don't give a shit.
yeah, they don't give a shit. And they're, because they actually like as much as they're up their own asses, they also like, I mean, maybe especially because they're women, the fact that they won't be embarrassed by their own convictions, whether
Of
it's a
course.
conviction
Or
around
their own
play or
bodies.
not. I just think,
Yeah.
I just think it's kind of cool because I
Yeah.
feel so often like chastened by my own embarrassment. Like, oh no, I'm taking myself too seriously. Oh no, I'm opening myself up for ridicule. And they're just like,
That's all
fuck it.
patriarchy. It's all patriarchal
Exactly.
programming.
No, it totally is. It totally is. So like the will to be both, profligate with your language, like, and just be like, this is, um, and to spend your energy for, for something other than so-called common knowledge, which they knew to be bunk and they knew to be a function of patriarchy, like a kind of profligacy as feminist politics. I was like, okay, maybe that's kind of cool. I don't know.
I love it. Absolutely. I could
Yeah.
see A, why you're so drawn to it, and B, now like I'm obsessed and I want a reading list. So I'm going to be bothering you
Yeah.
after this.
Yeah. Well, and not just because I have to plug it. It's like, well, that's chapter 4 of the book.
Yay. And so, that brings us back full circle. There are a million things we didn't talk about.
I
We
know.
meandered, but we meandered in a way that I was fascinated by. I'm just curious before we close up, because I've kept you way too long now, but I'm curious before we close up, is there anything explicit that we didn't even point to that you feel like, oh, we can't end the episode without, drawing attention to this at least? Did we skip anything really obvious?
I mean, yeah, there's a kind of big answer to this because I think,
Okay.
and a number of people have said this to me, like, wait a sec, I didn't realize this book was going to be so much about mental illness, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to like, I don't know. I don't know if like an actual trigger warning is appropriate or just like, hey, just so you know, this book is not just about me, but a number of women whose desire for their intelligence to be kind of like legible to patriarchy, um, or their desire to like control language and their own bodies led them into really fucked up places with regards to their own mental health. So like this book is largely about my own eating disorder. It's about the sort of forms of alcoholism or sometimes or self-harm that marked all of these women who were kind of obsessed with crossword puzzles. That's one of the things that led me into the book. It's like why did I at age 15 almost to the day start writing crossword puzzles and stop eating? And I always knew there was some connection, but it felt a little tenuous or like I couldn't really explain it. And partially through researching all these other women, whether it was eating disorders or other forms of self-harm or harming others, it was clear to me that their fixation on trying to control language and the kind of punishing relationship that they developed towards language was related to the punishing relationship they developed towards themselves and other women. And I just so that's like a whole theme that runs through the book that we didn't talk about. But I wanted to
God,
like
we could do a
alert.
whole other hour on that.
I know. But I wanted to like alert readers to that because I don't want anyone to be like, what the fuck? I thought this was going to be about crossword puzzles because it is still about crossword puzzles, but it's also about the kinds of distortions that we make when we think that we can control the uncontrollable.
Well, yeah, and let's also call
So
it
yeah,
what it is. Like the things that happen to marginalized people when they've been like gaslighted by a system. Uh,
totally.
and I
Yeah,
think
no,
that
that's totally it.
yeah, as
I mean, there's
somebody who
also like,
practices psychology, like a huge part of what I do
yeah,
when I'm working with women is help them like help them clarify a normal reaction to an abnormal situation that just historically has been
Totally.
pathologized.
Totally. I mean, so there's like a whole thread running through the book of like what is women's language? Because as a
Yeah.
woman who keeps being solicited to write crossword puzzles in part to like because there's not enough women writing them, people want to like diversify their bylines. I've been asked to like think what is women's language? What if it was my job to sort of represent women in this syntaxless form. And so throughout the book, there are these forms of women's language that are all adjacent to madness, like, is it hysteria? Is it, the language of feminism, right? Which is pathologized as crazy all the time. Or is it, some form of subversive language play? And does that also descend into madness? And those of us in the book who are, whether it's eating disorders or alcoholism or, what, how are we trying to speak through our bodies and through our pathologies when we don't feel like we have the language to articulate a certain kind of political pain? So that's a whole thread that runs through the book that I just want to like make sure no one's totally surprised if they pick it up, or
It's
maybe they'll be drawn
important.
to it for that
Yeah,
very
it's an
reason.
important
Yeah.
thread, and I don't think it's a thread to, and I'm not saying you are, but I don't think it's a thread to apologize for. I get the sort of warning, but, like, it's a thread that I think, a lot of women are going to identify with, whether they've struggled with an eating disorder or alcoholism. Like, I struggle with just garden variety depression, I've had it up my whole life, and, like, there is that part of me that's like, "Yes, this is clinical. Yes, there's something going on in my brain. Yes, I take antidepressants," and there's another part of me that's like, "This is a normal reaction to the world we live in," and so, I think a lot of women are going to identify with that inherently, but I also think a lot of men and not to make there be a total sex binary, because obviously there's something in between there, but and a lot kind of around there. And for the women or individuals who whether it's trans women or cis women or non-binary people who are reading your book, who are listening to this episode, I think that's going to speak to them personally. I would not be surprised if a lot of people didn't identify with those experiences, regardless of kind of the spectrum of severity. But I think for a lot of the men who are listening to the show, because I do have a larger male audience than female, which is super weird. I think it just goes back to this being a science show, sadly. Those perspectives are needed and they need to be heard. And, sadly, sometimes we preach to the choir. I think it's a self-selection. The very people who really need to be hearing this message are probably not listening to this show. But I think there are enough men who want to understand and want to push through some of those patriarchy, because they're just as affected. So or maybe not just as affected, but they are affected negatively by the patriarchy. So I am glad that message is there, because I think it's one that needs to be heard and shouldn't be apologized for, damn it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying. There's like this motif that I think runs throughout the book. There's this woman at the end of it named Ruth Von Full, who's a champion crossword puzzle solver, and then a cryptanalyst, and then a amateur Joyce scholar. Sorry, there's noise outside my building. But she wrote this haiku that was published late in life in Harper's, and it says. What a paradox is an unbending person who can't unbend. And I think it's a strange like metaphor for all the women in the book who, for various reasons have tried to demonstrate the intensity of their intelligence and get really caught or stuck because their intelligence isn't compatible with their gender identity. And so hopefully, or the ways that you can manifest intelligence in our culture isn't always compatible with being a woman or being feminine. And so it's that stuckness that the book is trying to sort of like, if there's a sort of way to summarize the personal or the memoir component of the book, it's like my own unbending.
I love that so much. And I don't think that we are having these conversations enough, at least not in the sort of I'm going back to like being very meta, but the mainstream of it all. And so I'm really glad to.
That's why I was like glad to be able to write it as a commercial press book and not
Yeah.
just for other academics. Yeah,
Oh,
totally.
that's amazing. It's I want to thank you for doing the work, and like really that's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of introspective work, and you went through that to share this with us. So I'm grateful for actually producing this book. But then B, obviously I'm grateful for you taking so much time out of your schedule to be here to share this with us, and yeah, just to have
Oh, it's
this, like, I
totally
think
my
important
pleasure.
conversation. Oh, I'm glad. So
It's
everybody, the book
yeah.
is The Riddles of the Sphinx: Inheriting the Feminist History of the Crossword Puzzle by, I'm going to say it, I am, Dr. Anna Shechtman. Anna, thank you
Oh,
so
thanks.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and let me know when it goes online. I'm excited to share it.
Absolutely. Oh, and everyone listening, thank you for being here week after week. I'm looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.